If this doesn't pique your interest, I don't know what will. So I give the word to Patty.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I'm excited to be here today to talk about my ideas about how science and organizational change intersect with each other. So thank you for this opportunity to speak at the Serious Scrum Conference and kind of round out this wonderful day of thought leaders and change makers here virtually on Zoom. So you might recognize this photograph on my title slide here as Newton's cradle. Many of us may not be sitting at desks anymore in an office building, but these are pretty common features on people's desks. And I want you to think about how this Newton's cradle works and what concept it is demonstrating as we go through our presentation today. All right, so here's the man of the hour, or I guess in our case, 45 minutes, Sir Isaac Newton. So he was born in 1642 and died in 1726. So kind of the latter stages of the Enlightenment. So I thought I'd ask you, what do you know about him? What subjects was Isaac Newton passionate about studying and speaking about? So go ahead and throw some ideas in the chat, and then I'll share some things with you as well. Apples. The apple guy. Yeah, lovely hair. I agree. All right. Well, I can see this. This is going to be a great crowd. So Isaac Newton, he was probably somebody you remember from physics class or a physical science class. He was a physicist, but he was also a mathematician, which makes sense because physics involves a lot of math. He was also an astronomer, which is something that you might not know, but astronomy also deals with math and physics. And like many folks around his time, he was trying to create gold from other elements in the periodic table, probably to make some cash on the side. But he was also an alchemist, which is also something I did not know. And of course, like somebody who is very cerebral and studies various subjects, they want to share their ideas. So he was also an author. But did you know that he was also an organizational change agent or an expert in agility? Probably not, because I made that up. But let me share with you where I got that idea from. So a little bit about my background. My name is Patty. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I'm on the East Coast here, and it's about 1 o'clock for us over on this side of the pond. I have a bachelor's degree in geology. So if you're familiar with Sheldon Cooper from the Big Bang Theory, he will often say that geology is not a real science. But I assure you, I studied all of the subjects, all of the science disciplines to understand how the world works. And I was so passionate about it that I wanted to share that with others. So I went on to get my master's degree in science education. Now, my first career, that landed me as a middle school science teacher. So I showed up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed on the first day, really excited to share my science ideas with 13-year-olds. And I found that they were not that excited to be there. So over the course of the next year, I decided to change the way my classroom operated and reached back into what I learned with my master's degree and did some other additional studies in how do I create a student-centered classroom and take myself out and put myself on the side. So how do I get them to be empowered to take charge of their own learning? And what I realized many years later is that I was implementing Scrum and Agile practices into my classroom. Now, this was in the early to late 2000s. So I was kind of operating on an island by myself. I pushed this as far as I could possibly push it at that time. And I could only take it so far, as you probably could imagine. But After that, I decided to go into business, and I owned and operated a business for 8 years with another person. And that's where I learned how businesses start, how they grow, how they scale. And I played most of the roles in that business, like name it and I did it. And that gave me a 360-degree perspective on how organizations operate. So I took that and I translated that into my Scrum Master and Agile Coach career. And I landed in many different industries and many different company sizes, and grew to be extremely passionate about Scrum Masters. And I founded my own consulting firm, which focuses on training and empowering Scrum Masters to learn those skills as outlined in Scrum.org's white paper, right? The 6 stances, as well as the Scrum guide itself. So as you can imagine, and as some of you have probably experienced, you go into an organization and it's chaos, right? And then you start to ask, and other people start to ask, what's easier to change here? The organization's structure or its culture? And what I've noticed is that it's a bit of a chicken or egg type situation. We need to handle both. We know both are important, but where do we even start? Especially when you're talking about a really large organization that has a great deal of complexity. So some people will say, let's start with the org chart. Changing the structure is probably easier. You know, we move some people around, we change reporting structures, we give people new titles, and voila, we are agile, or voila, we're doing Scrum, right? You've all heard that before. People think that that's all it takes. But as you probably know, organizational changes are not as easy as one wants to believe. They cause a lot of disruption, and they cause a lot of fear and panic in people. And maybe rightly so, because a lot of times when you change the structure, all of a sudden people start looking at, okay, what employees can we eliminate? How can we become more efficient? And that really scares people. So organizations will change their structure, and maybe they're only willing to go so far at first, but they will run into roadblocks. So where does that leave us, right? Culture. Let's try to change the culture first. But as we know, changing culture is very difficult. You have a whole network of people that have their common behavior patterns and communication patterns, and these are well worn, kind of like a path going through the woods. It's safe to take it. And when you come in there as a Scrum Master or as an Agile Coach or some other type of change agent, and you start nudging people towards new ones, you are often met with resistance. Some people are, afraid. What does it mean if I have to do things a different way now? Some people will just say, well, this is the way we've always done things here. I don't want to participate in this. So a lot of frustration builds. And as we were promised, Scrum was supposed to solve everything, right? Delivery really fast, save money, get efficient, all these things that people are hoping Scrum will do for them end up not happening, so to speak. So people will turn around and blame Scrum as the cause of their problems. But what it's important to point out is that Scrum is just a mirror. Agile is just a mirror. It's holding up a mirror to the challenges your organization is facing. And it's a valid question. What do you want to do about this? But oftentimes we feel like we're on an island. We're all by ourselves. And angry stormtroopers are showing up at our desk and saying, we don't want to do this. You're causing us all these problems, Scrum Master or Agile Coach or whomever it might be. And as that person who's trying to implement some change for the better, you start to feel like you can't do anything to help the situation. You start to feel like things are out of your control and you have no way to influence them. And this triggers a fight or flight experience, right? You have that amygdala in your brain, that lizard brain who tells you either I need to be the Scrum police and force this on people, or I need to run away, right? Because the grass is greener somewhere else, so to speak. But what you will find is if you go to different companies, you run into the same challenges everywhere. And it's because you're dealing with human beings and you're dealing with coaching people to change. And that's difficult. So you might need to think about it in a different way. Take a step back, try to calm down the fight or flight, and look to Isaac Newton. So if you think back to your science classes, and this might be a long time ago for some of us, you might recall Isaac Newton talking about 3 laws of motion. These are concepts he's pretty famous for, aside from his hair, of course. So we're going to talk about all 3 of these laws and how they relate to organizational change. So his first law is something to the effect of an object will not change its motion unless a force acts on it. An object will not change its motion unless a force acts on it. So in this case, the object could be thought of as your colleague, as your team, or as your entire company. But it's very clear here that something from the outside needs to help this object overcome its inertia, because otherwise it will just sit there and do the same thing over and over with the same results that don't work. All right, so let's go to law number 2. All right, so this is also Isaac Newton. I guess the challenges of not having an iPhone back then, we don't know exactly what he looked like. So this could be what he looked like as well. But this serious guy also said this: force equals mass times acceleration. So this is where math comes into play. Now, acceleration is a constant. The number doesn't change, 9.8 meters per second squared, or for those of us in the US, 32 feet per second squared. So if we put aside the A for a second, what we're left with is force equals mass. So it logically makes sense that the bigger the mass, the more force you need to get it to move. Now, I do want to point out one thing, that force is a dirty word in the Scrum community. We don't want to force anybody to do anything. So I like to think of this as influence. So substitute the word influence here. So you need a lot more influence if the organization is bigger. So let's take a look at an example that we might be all familiar with. So when I took my physics courses in college, my professor always used this as an example, the game of pool. And we've all experienced this or have seen this before. Some of us may be good, maybe not. But think of yourself as this person who has the cue stick in their hand and they're aiming in a very specific way to hit that cue ball. And ultimately, they want to affect that 11 ball. But I want to point out, kind of like what Isaac just told us in the second law, if that 11 ball is an enormous mass, if it's a big organization, you need to have compassion, because it takes an enormous amount of force to get that 11 ball rolling, to get it to overcome its inertia, its resistance to change. You can't do it alone. So one piece of advice that Agile coaches gave me when I started doing that particular role was, you have to understand what your sphere of influence is and speak to that. And don't take on the entire Agile transformation yourself, because you will burn out. So I want to point this out to you to know that this is a group effort. This takes everybody. It takes a village, so to speak. However, you can have an immense amount of influence on the people in your company, which will ripple effect out into the rest of your organization. So here's our third Isaac Newton, speaking of his third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So for every action I take, for every action I do, for everything I say, there will be a response. Keeping in mind that nothing is also a response, but there will be a response. So sometimes when we get overwhelmed and we are in a situation like this seems impossible, right? Especially if you're not good at playing pool. You're backed up against a wall. You're saying to yourself, I want to influence the orange striped ball. I'm not really positioned to do very much. And you have these stories in your head that I'm not good enough. I'm not going to have any effect. And then wham, you hit the ball and it goes out into no man's land. And you ultimately had no effect on that orange striped ball. Maybe you get angry at yourself. Maybe you get angry at the ball. Maybe you get angry at the organization because it sets you up for failure here. But I want you to keep in mind, going back to his third law, that a reaction is just a reaction. We put a judgment on that reaction. And instead of getting frustrated, instead of getting angry, instead of maybe being passive aggressive, whatever it might be, think about what is it that you can do different to get a different result. And this is the concept of retrospection, iteration, inspect and adapt. This goes back to Agile principle number 12. If you don't get that orange ball to move even a little bit, take a step back and reflect, what can I do differently to maybe get a different reaction or a different response? Because you are the only thing in this situation that you can control. And sometimes that's hard to embody. Sometimes that's hard to wrap our heads around. But what you will notice is if you change your action, the things around you in your environment will 100% start to change. So we're going to add another layer of complexity onto this, which has to do with systems thinking. So imagine this situation, right? You're the cue ball, and you go out and you affect the two ball. And then you walk away and think, my job's done. I'm good. But what you need to consider is that two ball is going to then move and impact the three ball. So when you affect someone, that someone will turn around and affect someone else. So if you have a positive effect on the two ball, that two ball is more likely to have a positive effect on the three ball. If there's a negative impact, that negative impact might go ripple down the chain, so to speak. So it's always good to think about what is the downstream effect of what you do, because you absolutely have an impact on the three, even if you don't realize it. And there's a great book that I love to refer people to really understand this concept, especially in the context of business. It's called Upstream by Chip Heath. And it talks about how businesses often address the downstream problems and nothing ever changes. So what they need to consider is, if you go back to the upstream origin, if we inspect and adapt there, will that help translate down and fix that downstream problem? And this is especially important when thinking about impediment removal. So sometimes Scrum teams, they have an idea for an impediment removal that's existing outside their team. And the Scrum Master might go to somebody outside the team and say, this is my team's idea. And the response might be, well, no, we can't do that, or we'll think about it. And then that maybe the team didn't consider the whole system when making their suggestion, but also the leader, it might behoove that person to come to the team and give them a little explanation about the system so they understand why that impediment may not be removed or may not be removed in the way that they're imagining it could be. So this is about starting a conversation to help this organization move forward. And it takes all parts. right? It's not just the team's responsibility or the Scrum Master's responsibility. And here's another level of systems thinking to consider as well. Here's our friend Kermit the Frog. He is attempting, we'll see how this works, right? He's attempting to hit that black ball into that entire group of red balls. So he needs to take a step back and consider his one action will spur many reactions simultaneously. And again, you cannot necessarily control what all those reactions are, but you can take a step back and consider what some of those things might be and plan accordingly. And if you get to know these people on this red team, so to speak, maybe you'll understand and it will help guide you in your action better because you understand them on a human level. You know how they behave, you know how they respond. But I'm going to add another layer of complexity here because the reality of the situation is in a large organization, there are many games being played on one table. So let's say this gentleman right here, he is aiming for that cue ball to hit that red ball into the pocket directly across from him. You know, that's his goal, that's his solution, that's what he's looking to do. His colleague over here might be thinking, you know what? I have a different solution to get that ball into that pocket. I'm going to put my cue ball down on the table and I'm going to aim as well. So in reality, there are different people trying to address the same problem at the same time. They may not even be aware of each other. So sometimes people are working on the same thing and they don't even know it. And it's causing what I like to call chaos and uncertainty. It's causing dysfunction. And bringing these folks together to talk about this and have a conversation around it may help with this situation. But also, he might decide to put down his ball on the table and aim for a completely different pocket. So same problem, different solution. Again, having a conversation or facilitating a conversation here can help with the complex, chaotic, overwhelming situation that happens as a result. Keep in mind, we're talking about two people here. Organizations often have multiple people doing this. And unfortunately, what this leads to is people acting out of a state of fear. They see all this going on around them. It's very uncertain. They don't know what's happening. They don't know who's doing what. There's a lot of politics at play. And then people start acting out of fear, making poor decisions in this state of fear. And while they may not be intentionally hurting others, people may perceive it that way. So it's helping people and coaching people to take a step back before they make the decisions to respond to this environment, to calm themselves down and to think about, when I react to this, what is going to happen after that? And this takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of work. It's like flexing a muscle. But the concept that I'm circling around here is emotional intelligence. Now, this is a topic that I've been talking about for many years at this stage of the game. I realized this through my studies as a teacher, through my studies as a yoga instructor many years ago. It's about becoming aware of who you are, what your behavior patterns are, how you respond to situations, and being able to adjust in the moment if you want to get a different response from the people across from you. So there is some intellectual aspects to this, but there's also some heart aspects to this. And what you will notice is if you take a step back and consider improving your emotional intelligence, you will have a major impact on your colleagues, your teams, and it will be a ripple effect across your entire company. Now, I mentioned I've been talking about this topic for a while. Again, 4 years ago, when I started speaking about this, I felt like I was on an island. But I really believe that the pandemic has caused us to see into other people's lives in a way that we've never seen before. We have empathy for them because we see what's going on in their backgrounds. We see what they're struggling with in their homes, because now work for some of us still is in our home. So the response to our colleagues has changed, and the conversation in companies has changed. And I'm excited about this because when changing from a very prescriptive manufacturing style world, the thing that was developed during the Industrial Revolution, and forming an agile organization and Scrum teams, we're not just turning a widget anymore and moving our piece on for the next person. We have to interact with each other. And this is a new skill set that we need to learn, because, take it from me as a former teacher, we are not, this is not the focus in school. So in some ways, our education system has to change, but also the adults who are in charge of the education have to change. And this starts with you. This starts with the individual. So we're going to talk a little bit about how, as an individual, you can improve your emotional intelligence, how as a team, you can improve your emotional intelligence, and ultimately, how an organization can improve its emotional intelligence. So let's start with the individual. And I feel like this could be a talk in and of itself, because this is a big topic. So we're just going to kind of talk about things on a very high level here. But as an individual, and this is based on the work Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, highly recommend you read it. Emotional intelligence is broken down into 5 different categories. So the self-awareness piece, understanding who you are, what your makeup is, so to speak, how you act, how you react, how you speak, and then understanding what happens in response to those things. And is that something that I need to inspect and adapt? And this is where the self-regulation piece comes in. So how can you test and learn with different actions to see what different responses you get? And this takes a lot of internal motivation. This constant reflection, as you probably all know, this retrospection takes a lot of mental effort and a lot of stretching yourself out of your comfort zone. And sometimes you have to dig deep and be really motivated to continue on that path. But what this will do is it will develop empathy for others. When you start to understand yourself and how you react, you start to look at other people a little bit differently. And you think, well, instead of that person being a jerk and they want to ruin my life, maybe there's something going on that I don't know about. And if I got to know them as a human being, I would understand. And then I can speak to them differently. I can react to them differently. I can coach them differently. And one of the hardest pieces that I had to, overcome to really land and nail my Scrum Master role is my social skills, because I was a classic introvert. And I like to talk to one person, and I like to go in the corner and talk to that person the whole time. And I like to talk to the people that I jive with and that people like me. I want to talk to those people. And I had to realize, as a Scrum Master and as a coach, I need to be able to interact with all types of people, regardless of whether they appear to like me, whether they're resistant to me. I have to know who each one of those people are as human beings, so I can get to know them and react with emotional intelligence when I interact with them. All right, so let's go to the team aspect. So since we're all hopefully interested in Scrum here, one of the ways that you can help your team, whether you're the Scrum Master or some other facilitator, is hold effective Scrum events. Now, that might mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but go back to the intent and purpose of each event. and they are to inspect and adapt and drive continuous improvement. And this absolutely applies for emotional intelligence, helping people understand and build their individual emotional intelligence, and then how they can interact with each other to be an emotionally intelligent unit. This will help them navigate conflict successfully because, conflict is there. It's maybe just hidden under the carpet, but navigating through these differences of opinions and philosophies and approaches will help a team move forward when they run into these situations. And the idea is, again, as a Scrum Master or whoever that facilitator of this is to help the team be able to do this themselves, be able to be self-organizing and self-managing. So you can step back and coach this, and they can handle this themselves. Finally, going to the organizational element of this. The organization as a whole needs to make a commitment to train and coach all employees so they have awareness of their actions, others' reactions to those things, and how these impact the entire system. So this is not just a team level shift. Everybody is responsible to reflect on themselves and understand how they affect others. And this is where the grass movements for this starts. It starts with the individual, but it ripples out from the team into the organization. But leaders need to be on board with this. They need to understand the importance of emotional intelligence and the benefits to their company in order for them to want to invest in training and coaching their employees in this way. So, to wrap this all up before we get to our questions, going back to Isaac Newton and his laws, right? We need to act upon whatever it is to help it overcome its inertia. That the bigger the object is, the more inertia we're going to have to overcome, the more we're going to have to band together to do this. And then the third piece is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So yes, this starts with you. You must push the first domino over, because if you don't do it, nobody else is going to feel safe doing it. But this will absolutely have a ripple effect. This will help your teams and your organization become emotionally intelligent, and this will help them find success with Scrum.